Predominantly Catholic, I would need to train myself to be familiar with Catholicism. You might even say the language of Catholicism. You understand what I mean. What they mean by the vocabulary that they use and the things that they say. That's what our third year at the School of Preaching really is. It's an intense language school. See, we teach them about false doctrines like Calvinism, premillennial dispensationalism. And the man of God, the preacher today, has to be well equipped in a variety of areas. And one of those areas has to do with some of the rank philosophies of this world. Atheism, agnosticism. And I want to begin, I have a lot of material to cover, but I think this is really important for me to begin with this story to try to communicate to you the significance of this subject. I teach this at the School of Preaching, and I always tell the students this class is about communication. Let me tell you about two studies that I have. They were not traditional studies. The first one I want to tell you about is with a young man. I literally knew him from the time he was a baby. Grew up in the Abingdon congregation, did some preaching as a teenager. Then he went off to, I'll say one of our, and I say that with quotation marks around it, one of our Christian universities. And he lost his faith. And he came home and claimed he believed nothing. And we studied. And probably, and matter of fact, it took a couple of years for us to get to the point that he'd even have discussions with me. And we had discussions probably for about 7 months. And let me just tell you something. Don't get the idea that this is simple. I can deal with this. Wesley Simons taught me a long time ago. You know, I was studying with some oneness Pentecostals. If you're not prepared, they'll eat your lunch. And the same is true regarding these philosophies in this world. And that kid was well indoctrinated. And he claimed he knew nothing. And I pushed him because I kept wanting to push him and help him see the inconsistencies of his views. And finally he got to the point that he affirmed that it was very possible that he was really just a brain in a laboratory jar, and that there was a scientist stimulating the experiences that he was having, that it really wasn't even happening. Let me tell you something, folks. That's amazing. There was a gentleman that I asked to begin helping me as we had these discussions. Great Christian, great intellectual. And finally the studies concluded, and I guess you could say we had no success. The second gentleman, though, let me tell you about him. I met him about 18 years ago. I busted my head open, Providence being what it did, brought me to the emergency room at Abingdon, Virginia. He was a doctor there, and he sewed my head up, and I'm always asking questions. I said, "Where do you worship?" And that's usually a question. I ask that question on purpose, and people don't know what I mean, and I explain. And he said, "I don't believe in God. There is no God." And so we began talking. He affirmed evolution. And that began a study that lasted for probably about 4 years. Today he's a faithful child of God. He's been a supporter of the school. I don't know if he's supporting the school now financially, but been a supporter of the school. And I tell you this, he came to a knowledge of the truth because he had an honest heart, not because of my expertise. He kept throwing things at me and said, "Well, let's talk about this. Let's study. Let's read this book together. Let's look at this." And I was honest with him, and I said, "Listen, if you can convince me that there's no God, I'll become the #1 evangelist for atheism. But let's just be honest." And I say all that to say, you're going to have some heartbreaking experiences out there. And the various ungodly philosophies that are in our culture today, we have to approach them with the same vigor and the same enthusiasm that we approach Calvinism, or dispensationalism, or oneness Pentecostals, or any of these other false doctrines. Now, what is a worldview? and this comes from James Sires. I think Sire has the best definition, and I'm just going to condense it for you. A worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart. It's the way you look at life, and as a result of that, that provides a foundation on which we live and move and have our very being. In other words, you live consistent with that. Well, how do you figure out what a worldview is? He has 8 questions. Incidentally, I know a lot of people like Ravi Zacharias. He's a bright guy and everything, Calvinist, unfortunately. He's reduced it to 4 questions. I think he misses it. I think Sire's right. I think there's 8 questions. I won't cover all 8 questions. The very first one, what is prime reality? What do you know when you can't count on anything else? What do you know? The atheists say there's no God. The Bible believer says there's a God. What is a human being? The evolutionist says a human being is a highly complex biological machine. We say we are beings created in the very image of God. What happens to a person at death? I stood beside a grave this morning. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. For the atheist, it's extinction. You're gone. Why is it possible to know anything at all? I'll come back to that in just a second. Number 6 is the one I like to talk about. How do we know what's right and wrong? But you know what? If you don't deal with number 5, you're wasting your time. That is the argument. Though, and I've said this before, and I might back off of it someday, I think that perhaps the most important class we teach at the School of Preaching is epistemology. Folks, that is the battle line. We live in a world where people say, we can't know anything. And we've got to take that on, and you're not going to answer this with trite little cute little things that are impressive to us. You know, someone said, well, there's no such thing as absolute truth. Are you certain about that? Yes, I am. I am consistent. And you know what they say? You know what that young man said to me? He said, I know it's bizarre. That just proves my point. I'm telling you guys, we have got to equip ourselves to really be able to deal with this. Now, I didn't give you that. I'll try to stay up now. 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse number 32 is a great verse for us. The sons of Issachar, who had an understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. That's where we need to be. We need to understand the times in which we are living. We're concerned about our current cultural consensus, and I think we've missed it. I really do. We're concerned that can't have prayer in school. I know Trump signed something, or I heard something about that the other day, but people get all tore up about that. Listen, and I want you to really listen to me, because this is so crucial to us. We got people that don't pray at home. People who claim to be children of God, they don't pray. No Bibles in the school. Listen, we got young people, we can't pay them to open up their Bible app. We can't pay them to come to Bible study, and we're concerned about Bibles in the schools. No respect for marriage. Can you believe they want to let 2 men marry, 2 women marry? And we got brethren in the church that they say, you know what, you can get married and divorced for any reason. And let me tell you what may be worse than that. And I say worse than that in the sense that it is the beginning of the disrespect for the institution of marriage. We got people who are technically scripturally married, but a husband doesn't love his wife the way Christ loved the church. And a wife won't submit to her husband and respect her husband the way the church is to respect and submit to Christ. And that marriage has been broken in the heart. Yeah, there's problems out in the world, but let me tell you something. There's problems in the church. And if you'll allow me to paraphrase Judges chapter 21, verse 25, because I want us to understand from the beginning as we begin to talk about these things, excuse me, we've got to first apply this to ourselves. In our days, there is no king in the church. Everyone does what is right in his own eyes. And it's very important for us as we think about this to understand the importance of recognizing the authority of Christ and going to Him for everything. We could, as we look at the Western civilization from a historical standpoint, we could say that it's divided by Columbus, you know, in 1492. He sailed the seas of blue. And on one side, you have the old world. On the other side, you have the new world. Now, listen to me closely, because I want you to get the point that I'm about to make. You'll see the significance of this in a minute. Somebody could come along and say, no, man. Columbus wasn't the first. And you're right. What about Leif Erikson? Well, let me tell you about this. There's a lot of evidence the Polynesians, they came across the ocean to South America, man. So I'm not saying Columbus was the first guy, but he's kind of the dividing line, isn't he? He said, well, what's your point, Bill? Well, Western civilization is neatly divided in pre-Darwin and post-Darwin. If you don't get anything else out of this lesson, folks, I want you to get this. That's what we're battling. That is the issue. That changed everything. Now, I say what I did a minute ago about Columbus and Leif Erikson and the Polynesians. Let me tell you this. Darwin was not the first one to propose the idea of Darwinism, or the idea of unguided evolution, okay, macroevolution. Matter of fact, his grandfather had the idea, but his grandfather's idea, we might call it theistic evolution. It was guided, and Darwin rejected that. It's interesting to me that before Darwin came along, the philosophy of naturalism was well ensconced, and they were just desperately looking for some type of mechanism to validate their philosophy. So from that came the idea of Darwinism, and the phrase Darwinism was coined in 1944 by Richard Hofstadter in his book Social Darwinism, and he defined it this way: at the simplest level, a social Darwinist is one who believes that human societies should be organized so as to ensure the survival of the fittest, i.e., no concern should be shown to the weak and the unfit. Only in such a society, it is believed, can humanity evolve to its highest potential. Let me tell you something. That is the consensus today. Let me give you a brief picture, historical view of the development of philosophy in the West. But I want you to understand, you need to understand this development, because this can happen in one person's lifetime. This can happen in just a few years. If you go back to the period we call pre-modern, incidentally, we would consider ourselves pre-modern. Doesn't that make you feel prehistoric, you know? I mean, you're way back there. What did pre-modern man believe? Pre-modern man believed that we needed revelation from God, and we needed to use the good mind that God has given us. We needed to use reason, and we had to have revelation from God. Now, I want you to get this. Pre-modern man, we would call it theism, or biblical Christianity, believed that reason was necessary. Take the very next step, and we come to the isthmus, which is deism. And I could talk a lot about deism, and it's a lot bigger than we think that it is. We define it very narrowly, and it's a wide spectrum. But at base, what deism does is reduce God and the necessity of God, because listen to what it does. Theism said reason is essential, necessary. Deism, modern man, you go from pre-modern to modern man. Modern man says reason is sufficient. And we have a reduction of God. Oh, there's still a God. We believe in God. We love God. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Don't steal, don't fornicate, and all that kind of stuff. But it's just not as necessary as it used to be. And that allows, historically it allows, and it allows in an individual's life, when that happens, it allows us to make the next step, and that's naturalism. Everything just happened. We don't need a God. We've got gravity, you know. And that's what one scientist said. We've got gravity. Isn't that stupid? Still didn't explain where gravity comes from. Now, then Darwin comes on the scene. Here's what I want you to get. The result of Darwinism is nihilism, which is actually anti-philosophy. It's point zero. There is no meaning to life. It's empty. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Vanity of vanities. Or I like the translation that says meaningless, meaningless. All of life is meaningless under the sun. And that idea of under the sun is when you only have this view. There's no heavenly view. It's only just, so what I see here, and let me tell you something, folks. Get honest about it. If all there is what we see and what we can touch and what we can taste, this life stinks. If there's no eternal perspective, then we are wasting our time. I'm not going to go over existentialism, Eastern pantheism, and New Age and all that. I'm not going to go through that. Here's the thing that you need to understand. Every worldview following the turn of the 20th century, 1900 and forward, every worldview that came along was desperately trying to somehow find an answer to nihilism without going back to the God of the Bible. Here's the biggest problem that people have. Why should I get out of bed? There's got to be some meaning in life. If all I'm doing is just grinding out another day and grinding out another day, there's no meaning to life. I wish I had time, and I would invite you to come to the Worldviews class that begins next quarter. Nietzsche, such a sad, sad man, and he recognized the depravity and absolute poverty of his philosophical view, but he was convinced that he was right. Nietzsche was the father of postmodernism. We start saying, postmodernism started around 1990. No. Really started back around 1890 with Nietzsche. And listen to me closely, because this is something we need to understand. If we're going to understand the language and we're going to understand where they're coming from, they don't even understand it. Just like Calvinism, you need to know Calvinism better than your opponent. You need to understand where they're coming from. These poor souls, desperate, empty souls, don't understand. They're rebelling against modernism. And guess what? I'm all for it. Because modernism says reason is sufficient. You don't need God's Word. You just use reason and logic and you can figure it out. That needs to be rebelled against. That's right. Unfortunately, what they end up doing is just like going down a spiral staircase. It just keeps getting worse and worse. Listen, I'm just going to share a little bit of something that Nietzsche had to say. He said, the nihilistic consequences of our natural science. And this is a guy who's thoroughly atheistic, thoroughly a subscriber of Darwin's views and the social implications of his. The nihilistic consequences of our natural science from its purest pursuits, there follows ultimately a self-decomposition. And he goes on and he talks about this a lot. He says, our society is going to come up empty. And it's horrible, the consequences of killing God. He talks about it in the parable of the madman. It's just horrible what he realizes. And many times I've thought to myself, if I could go back in time and talk to someone in the past, I'd want to go talk to Nietzsche. I really would. And I'd want to tell him, Frederick, there is a reason to get out of bed. I'm telling you, man, life is not as bleak and dark as you think it is. But I can't go back. But I can go next door to my neighbor. I can go to these kids in the church building. Incidentally, and I've got to really step on it. We're not losing our kids when they go off to university. We're losing our kids when they're about 10, 11, 12. That's right. And we need to equip them, thoroughly equip them to know the truth, not only about God's Word, but just like all other false doctrines, the false philosophies that the world is spoon-feeding them in our government education system and through the Discovery Channel and everywhere you go. You see, the reality is most people do not want to believe that evolution is true. But the consensus is macroevolution is true. They don't want to believe it. Because if they think through it, they know, man, this stinks. This is the pits. But everybody believes it's true. And how horrible is it? There's a bunch of quotes I wanted to share with you, but I'm just going to share one. You may have heard this from the movie Expelled. This is William Provine, biologist William Provine. This is what he has to say. The Darwinian revolution is still incomplete because we have yet to embrace all of its moral and religious implications. What are they? There is no ultimate foundation for ethics. You can't say, if you want to go out here and rape a woman, you can't say it's wrong. If you want to break into someone's house and shoot them mercilessly and burn their house down, you can't say it's wrong. No ultimate meaning in life. You don't even have a reason to get out of bed. And no free will. No free will? What's up with that? Oh, it's just a matter of the genes, man. It's in your DNA. If you go out here and you mass murder a bunch of people, it's not your fault. It's in the DNA. It's out of your control. You think about how that is a life that ultimately stinks. And yet, that's where a lot of people are. So, the current cultural consensus is we're going to try to somehow make all this stuff work together somehow. And we're going to try to find a reason to get out of bed in the morning. So here's what it comes down to. Here's where we are today. This comes from Phil Sanders. And I intended on the next two slides, I don't have time anyway, but I was going to illustrate to you on the next two slides how this works in our society. Here are the four pillars of postmodernism. It is a privatization of views. We hear this all the time. It's a woman's private choice. It's her body. No one else can tell her it's wrong. And this goes to a lot of other things as well. Pluralization, and we're concerned about relativistic pluralization. It doesn't matter how absurd, it doesn't matter how contradictory. They can all live together in harmony. So you believe one thing, I believe another thing, and all contradict, no problem. And then relativism. There are no absolutes. You can't say there's anything that's absolute, and that's absolute. Secularism. And this is a big one. If we could get this one, we would really, it would be like a key to unlocking the door to understand what's happening in our society. There's a reason why they don't want the Ten Commandments on the courthouse wall. And listen, I don't want a nativity scene on the courthouse lawn particularly, but there's a reason why they don't want it there that bugs me really bad. It's bad manners to talk about your religion in public. That's what it really comes down to. And I wish I had the time to draw this out for you, but here's what it really comes down to. There's things that they call reason. And that's truth. You know, now it's funny what they put down there, you know, because it's kind of fluid. But if you imagine a straight line, we'll call it the line of despair. Below the line of despair is reason. It's a sorry place to live, but we know these things are true. You know, maybe building bridges, mathematics, and they're even a little spongy on that stuff. But then you go down there, homosexuality is normal. Of course, that's absolute fact. You know what goes above the line? And they would say that is in the realm of faith. In other words, non-reason. I know that's not true, but that's the way they look at it. In the realm of non-reason. Your faith in Jesus. And you really shouldn't talk about it in public, because it's about the equivalent of me going out in public in the mall and talking to somebody. Let me tell you about the pink unicorn that comes to me at night. And they said, look, if you want to believe that, I mean, really, that's bad manners. For you to go talk about Jesus, about a God-man that came to earth, it's bad manners. And we've got to be aggressive, but we've got to understand where they're coming from, folks. I'm going to fast forward. I want to cover some lessons. Here's what we need to do. How are we going to reverse this? First and foremost, we have to focus on the gospel of Jesus. And that means we've got to proclaim the gospel of Jesus. I don't know why I've got Jesus up there. I'm not quite sure how that happened. But I really want to make this next point. We need to proclaim the good news because people are lost.
That's right.
And if you've said something, I'm not aiming this at anybody that I know of in this room. If you've said this in the past and I'm saying something wrong, I'm willing to talk about it. But if I hear one more preacher or elder proclaim that we need to be evangelistic because the numbers in the church are declining, I think I'm going to chirp. And that's a euphemism for something much more serious. That's not the reason why we need to evangelize. You don't care that our numbers are going down? I care about, and I say this because I believe this is what the Bible teaches, I care about the next person I meet that doesn't know Jesus is going to go to hell. Yes. And that needs to be our attitude. When our attitude is, boy, we've got to find some more people to fill the pews, let me tell you something. This current generation will reject you, and they'll be right for doing it. And I just hope to God that a true truth dispenser will come along and find them and share with them the gospel of Jesus Christ. The young people today, they want authenticity. They don't want some type of paper dolls and, they want the real deal, and they deserve it. And that means that we've got to live the gospel. We've got to live faithful to Jesus Christ. And then I'm going to read this. I thought a lot about this. This is very important for us. This is important in every age. But the postmodernists are demanding this because they're sick of pure reason. I'm not against reason and logic. I am against the idea that reason is sufficient. And they want the real deal. In everything that we do, we need to challenge worldly wisdom and the conventional culture because Jesus' life and death is the perfect pattern for every aspect of life, and He is profoundly counterculture. 1 John 2 and verse 15 says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." And we're going to have a hard time winning the world by being worldly light. And I'm going to tell you something. Here's the bottom line. The world's going to think we're nuts when we stand for what's right and we do what's right. And not, I hope that everyone here understands, we don't need to compromise on the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that includes the weird philosophies of this world. Well, it might be true that, you could have two opposing views that could... Don't go down that road, guys. Let's stick with the truth. And then communicate the gospel. We're in the communication business. That requires a transmitter and a receiver, but you got to be on the same frequency. And they're not going to change for our benefit. And so, if I'm talking to a Calvinist, this blew my mind when I found out what they meant by the sovereignty of God. I believe in the sovereignty of God. Hey, we're on the same page. They don't mean the same thing that we mean. They mean that if God wants to be sick and send someone to hell that never had a chance, He's sovereign. If He wants to be a gross sick, see, we got to understand. We've got to tune into their station so that we know what they're actually saying. And so we need to, this includes apologetics. We've got to defend against denominational error. Let me just say this. One of the great things about Tri-City School of Preaching, there was a time when, when I went to school in Knoxville, we were equipped for denominational error and things of that nature. That's great. And we have a few men in the Brotherhood that I'm very thankful for, that they specialize in a very narrow area. The average congregation of the Churches of Christ, this was a few years ago, maybe less now, is 91 members. And you think about it, we got congregations of 600, 700, 800. That means a bunch of them are really small. They don't need a man who can specialize. They need a utility man that can. And that means that the man that's coming out of a school of preaching today, he needs to be ready to deal with Calvinism and dispensationalism. And he also needs to be able to deal with the false philosophies of this world. And that means he needs to be well equipped. And he's got to really dig in. And we need to support these men in these efforts. And so we've got to defend against naturalism. And we've got to defend against the enemies within the body. And that means me. And that means you. It's really easy to point out the guy that's going to hold some radical view and say, you don't have to be baptized to be saved. What about the preacher who preaches on total commitment, being faithful to Jesus Christ, or the elder that teaches on that. And then he tells a shady joke, vile, dirty joke. Our young people get it. What about the father? Preacher's preaching on absolute submission to Jesus Christ, and he's sitting there nodding his head, maybe even says amen. His kids hear him. And then on Sunday night he says, nah, I'm tired. I'm not going back. I'd rather watch a football game. His kids get it. What about the wife? She speaks for ladies' classes, and she's a virtuous woman at services, and then when she's out at work and her kids see her, she's flirtatious with someone other than her husband. Her kids get it. And let me tell you something. If we're going to truly live the gospel, and I don't believe we turn this world upside down. What we do through the gospel is we get the world properly oriented, and when the world sees what's oriented, there's something wrong with you. What do you mean one man, one wife for life? No, that's a proper orientation. I know I've just turned your world upside down, but that's the way you're supposed to be looking at life. If I'm going to do that, I've got to live that kind of life. Thank you.